next speaker, Leslie, you there?
I am.
Hey, there you are. Are you in Las Vegas as well?
I am in Las Vegas.
Fantastic. So could you go into a little bit of your background for the audience, please?
Sure. First off, I want to just thank you for doing this and everyone who's worked on putting this on. This, as was just pointed out, this is a gigantic pause that the entire world is going through. This is a very unusual moment in time, especially, I mean, for many reasons. I'm going to point out a couple of things that are a little bit, and then I'll talk about my background. But I wanted to start with this. There's been a big shift in media over the last 20 to 30 years. As a student of, amongst other things, Marshall McLuhan and the evolution of media over the last few decades, I have found it so interesting how the way we perceive the world has changed in such a dramatic fashion based upon how specific media has become to us. What I see in terms of media is entirely different from what you see, Denise, different from what Steve sees, different from what Snowden sees, etc. It is tailored to us. Decades ago, when I was young, when the Earth was young, we all saw the first landing on the moon. We all saw the tragedy of the space shuttle. We all saw Tiananmen Square together. We all celebrated the bicentennial of the United States. And there was a commonality of messaging and culture that was not just national, it was even global to a great extent. That's dissipated to a very large degree. And we've seen a lot more, a lot of a polarization and conflict, both on a large basis and on a micro basis between people, between our friends, etc. It's a common experience now that people say, oh God, I gotta mute somebody, I can't handle the messages they send anymore, etc. It's a common human experience. Now, why am I bringing this up? Today, for the first time in modern history, this number of people on a global basis are all thinking largely the same things. We are all observing largely the same things, dealing with the same issues. And that isn't just a pause of take a break, see what's going on with the world. This is now a pause and a moment where we can establish commonality with people all around the world, no matter what they were before. The fact that they have to deal with this is in common, and it does create an opportunity to hopefully be able to establish common ground on a global basis. Okay, I'll put that soapbox away and get the other ones out in a minute. My background is in corporate finance and investment banking. I started on Wall Street in 1987 before the market crash in October of 87. I have worked with small cap and early stage companies essentially my entire adult life. I was one of the first investment bankers to focus on the internet and new media back when that was something brand new, back when people compared the internet to the CB radio phenomena of the 70s because they never thought there would be any businesses there of substance. Paul Krugman, the economist, was quoted in Red Herring magazine in 1998 saying the internet is a fad, Amazon will be bankrupt by the year 2000, and no one's ever going to make any money on the internet. I didn't agree. I thought it was a big thing. I spent a lot of time and focus on it. I went from that to looking at a number of other industries, running public and private companies. And along the way, I decided to focus on the online casino industry as something that I thought was going to evolve as a sort of a merging of entertainment and gambling. And of course, if you're going to look at the casino industry, you only come to one place, Las Vegas, which is how I ended up here. I'm a native New Yorker. I was born in New York City, raised there. And so in 2008 and 2009, I came here to do some research. I saw that the gaming industry was very interesting, but I also saw, more importantly, Denise and everyone else, that warm, dry, and sunny has a very distinct appeal as opposed to what I had encountered, what I'd grown up with in New York City. And so I decided, my wife and I decided to move out here. We moved to Las Vegas in 2010. Put a pin in that for a moment. I'm cannabis friendly and have been since I smoked pot at a bus stop in northern New Jersey when I was 15 years old on my way to high school for the first time. I taught myself how to snap my fingers with my left hand on that 45-minute bus trip, stoned out of my mind. And really, it was a game changer for me. I got to think, this is really something I like. I had resisted it for a long time, and I finally tried it. I continued to be involved with cannabis. I did a lot of research as I got older, and I knew that the prohibition was based upon lies, disinformation, and propaganda on a global basis, including hemp. I didn't think there would be any change in my lifetime. When I went to work in the financial industry, I stopped smoking pot. I stopped drinking alcohol. I didn't even drink coffee or use aspirin. I had a very austere life for a period of time. It was just a choice I made. I didn't have anything against any of it. It just wasn't at that moment in time for me. When I came out to Las Vegas and I decided to move here, I quickly saw that cannabis was legal for medical marijuana in Nevada on a very limited basis. It was really only half a law as compared to the law that we have now. I started to see as well with friends of mine that there were these medical marijuana dispensaries when I'd go visit them in San Francisco or Los Angeles, and they'd say, I'm going to go pick up some flower at the dispensary, and I would have no idea what that meant. It was entirely new to me. And so I did some research, and I saw that the illegal industry, the black market for cannabis in the United States, according to the United Nations and according to the Rand Institute, in 2010 was $42 billion a year. Bigger than professional sports in America, which were only 37 billion, including the NHL, NFL, Major League Baseball, and the NBA. That was a massive data point for me that really got me to take a look and say, when cannabis does become legal, if it ever does, the economic opportunity will be unlike anything we've ever seen in our lifetimes or many lifetimes. It will even eclipse, in all likelihood, because of hemp, what the internet and new media represented. That's a very big statement, and I believe it still absolutely stands true, and I have the data points behind it. So I was doing all this research when Colorado and Washington made cannabis legal for adult use for the first time in 2012. That was the only data point I needed, including the trend lines that I'd been looking at in terms of what the electorate was looking at, what the overall opinion was around medical marijuana and adult use of marijuana eventually. So I unwound all of my other projects and started to focus exclusively on cannabis and hemp, and try to understand what they represented in terms of an opportunity. I'd gotten very involved from the regulatory perspective, dealing with the business issues and the nexus of business issues, regulation, and political realities. And I've advised states and countries on their regulatory framework since. I still advise the state of Nevada informally. I have advised the state of Pennsylvania, the state of Florida, the state of Oregon, the country of Costa Rica, and now I'm working very closely with the country of Mexico, as they're about to be the largest country to fully legalize cannabis in the world for adult use and for medical and for hemp, all at the same time. So that's my background. I deal with business issues. We really look at the convergence and to the convergence of those issues to help us understand how can we help entrepreneurs and business operators be more successful and create more value, where we work with them to create more value. One. Two, how can we get them to liquidity? Because this industry has some very specific constraints on it economically that other industries don't. And as a result, you're not going to be able to see the same type of reward if you were to start any other business in the world because of the issues surrounding this. And then three, we work with people who are deploying capital, large amounts of capital into the industry to help them avoid, lighting on a fire like so many people have. We've watched Constellation Brands light $2.5 billion on fire and just stand by the warmth as it burned to dust. We've seen the money raised in high times, as Steve brought up, just, lit it on fire and turned it to dust and smoke. And I work to keep that from happening for the people that work with us in terms of what they're doing and the capital that they're deploying. So that's a little bit about me, Denise. I hope that satisfied what you were asking.
It sure does. I had to unmute myself. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I know Snowden has some questions as well. So one question that I have for you, Leslie, is that there are individuals from other countries on this webcast, and we're really happy that we were able to unify the whole world. Other than Antarctica, we're still working on that continent. Do you know anybody down there that's an advocate? We need them online for the next one so we can call it a truly world conference. But there are other countries out there that are struggling with access and struggling with policy and all of that. I know you've been able to help certain states. Do you also help countries?
Yes, without a doubt. We had been working with the people who had authored the original medical marijuana law that had been gotten to 57 out of 60 votes in the legislature in Costa Rica. It did not pass. We're still working with the country of Costa Rica to assist them in that through some of the large stakeholders. We had been, I have been an advisor to President Vicente Fox and his Canna Mexico event, as well as his initiatives to assist Mexico and the people that he works with in establishing a regulated market. I also have been working with a number of people who are very close to the country of Mexico. I have been working with Dr. Mario Acosta, who is likely going to be essentially the cannabis and hemp czar for the country of Mexico. I have met with some of the leaders throughout the Mexican government to assist them and provide what I could to them so that their regulatory framework will provide the greatest value to the citizens of Mexico possible, while being good for business and creating a economic boon to the country, not just in tax revenue, in wealth creation and more. And so, yes, the answer is we do work with countries. We are currently looking to have some conversations with the government of Guatemala. We have been recently approached by people that are stakeholders in Brazil. And we're looking primarily right now at the Spanish and Portuguese speaking world, because it seems like they are the earliest adopters from the perspective of really getting ahead of this, as you know, obviously after Canada and what they've done.
Thank you. Snowden, did you have a question as well?
Yeah, I want to touch back on something that you mentioned too with regard to the polarization. And one of the beauties of the cannabis industry is that it's one of those unifying issues. It transcends party lines, partisanship. So how do you see that playing a role in the future of this industry, in terms of bringing people together and getting support for these laws that need to be passed both here in the States and abroad as well?
So the question as I understand it is, how do we see this as a bipartisan issue domestically and abroad? And what are the issues that will allow it to unify political opposites and political division to be able to move this ahead? And
exactly. So, and thank you for articulating what was in my brain. That's exactly right.
I just want to make sure I understood what you were asking.
Yes.
So now let me start out by saying this. It is, in fact, a bipartisan issue in the United States and beyond. That being said, there are still what someone who I think the world of, Rick Cusick, who is the former associate editor of High Times, he had a term that I would like to give him credit for that I use all the time: the artifacts of prohibition. They are still with us. And so even though it is a bipartisan issue, it is not having the seamless and smooth transition into normalization that would be the best for the world. It's taking time, because there are people still out there like the former Attorney General Jeff Sessions and many others, and even Chuck Grassley, and even Dianne Feinstein, and even the presidential candidate, the former Vice President Joe Biden, who do not have a clear understanding of the data. And we have not been able to have conversations with these people where we've been able to present all of the data, where they have been able to review all the data, understand what's really going on. So the artifacts of prohibition, the gateway drug theory, the psychosis that this can, that there's some issue with psychosis, and so many other things that go along with this are still there. I'm going to tell a funny anecdote I hope you like, which I think speaks to this. One of my dear friends, Joe Dolce, Brave New Weed. Shout out to him. He has done a great service to the entire industry. In his book, Brave New Weed, he talks about how Harry Anslinger, who was largely responsible for the prohibition of cannabis and hemp, had hired a psychopharmacologist who was of questionable ethics and questionable pedigree to become the official psychopharmacologist of the United States government as it regards cannabis. And that's where a lot of the reefer madness came from. There was, in fact, during that period, a defense to murder called psychosis by way of marijuana. So you could defend that you killed somebody because you used marijuana and you were psychotic as a result. There was a famous trial in New Jersey where people were or in New York, where two people were accused of killing a cab driver or something like that. And they pleaded innocent by way of psychosis due to marijuana consumption. And they called the official psychopharmacologist of the United States to come testify. And in the Star Ledger of New Jersey, which is not a unknown newspaper in that region, it is quoted, his testimony is quoted as saying, on the stand, he had used marijuana himself, and under its use, he was turned into a bat in his office. He flew around his office and got stuck down an inkwell as part of his testimony for that case. Now, what does that have to do with your question? What it has to do with is the fact that people could be that way out and be associated with the federal government. The artifacts are that there are still people who believe things like that. There is still that thread in the oldest generation of people out there. There's a lot of people that believe that marijuana, reefer madness is a real thing, and cannabis and marijuana are evil, and everything associated with it are going to, and when I say evil, that they are cultural degradants that hurt society on a national basis in a significant way. And so as long as it takes for that to fade from our global consciousness, we will still have the artifacts of prohibition like that keep us from having the true normalization. And the best example of that is the Farm Bill of 2018 that passed, making hemp legal in the United States, completely federally legal. You can grow it, you can process it, you can sell products based upon it, and we see the birth of the enormous diaspora of CBD and hemp products throughout the country. I mean, there's thousands of them now, and yet it's still almost impossible to get banking if you call yourself an actual hemp company and a CBD company. It's almost impossible to get merchant services. Still, 2 years later, it's such a challenge, and that's because the artifacts of prohibition, even once it's completely legal, still are with us and are in people's minds and still prevent the normalization. So it is a much longer battle than we should have to fight.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that had to do with just the ignorance at a certain level of the people who were writing that bill. But, also the absurdity of removing the trace amounts of THC from Schedule 1 if it's in hemp, but not removing CBD from Schedule 1. It was just something I couldn't understand until the FDA sent out the notice reminding everyone that CBD is in Schedule 1, and so therefore it can't be added to food or to beverages. But that leads me to this question for you, which is how much do you think that, on top of the artifacts of prohibition, how much do you think the lobbies of the industries that stand to lose with the legalization of cannabis plays a role in that?
So let me say two things. First, let me say in the last 7 days, we had one of the most significant changes to scheduling that we have ever seen in cannabis just this last week, when Epidiolex was moved to Schedule 5, the lowest schedule on the schedule of controlled substances. And it's purely CBD. There's nothing else there. And the fact that Epidiolex, the GW Pharma drug, has been put on Schedule 5 is an absolute um, hint of where we're going to be going. It's showing that we are headed to descheduling of CBD and eventually THC, where THC will be, and cannabis in general, the whole plant will be treated like alcohol and tobacco. It will be descheduled and will be regulated on the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives. And that's where it's going to be regulated now. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. The second thing I'm going to say is that as it regards the scheduling issues, we're seeing a lot of shifts and a lot of nuance in this. I want to speak to something else that comes from that. Because CBD in Epidiolex has gone through the entire FDA clinical trial process, we have a very specific conundrum at a national level on CBD products, and we also have an incredible opportunity that it creates. So, because CBD to the FDA is now recognized as a drug, and it is scheduled as a drug, that means that even though you can find CBD in hemp, the FDA's position, going back to August of last year, they stated, one of the attorneys that works for the FDA stated, if you are transporting CBD across state lines, you are breaking federal law, period. And the reason is people I think there's a lot of confusion around that. And the confusion is, and to give a clarifying point, why their position is, and it's not an unreasonable position, except for what I'm about to bring up afterwards. If you were to go grow green mold that had penicillin in it and just start selling penicillin, you can't do that. Penicillin is a regulated substance. And the FDA would say, no, you're not allowed to just grow mold and sell penicillin across state lines, because there was no prior art of penicillin before it had been discovered by Fleming. Now, the reason why CBD will be different and will be allowed for interstate commerce in the very near future is because of the precedent of something called red yeast rice and a few others. Red yeast rice is a supplement available at any Whole Foods or any vitamin store around the country and online. You can buy it and have it sent to you. Well, it turns out that red yeast rice has lovastatin, the exact same chemical, down to the molecular compounds as you find in the prescription drug lovastatin. It's exactly the same. There's no difference. There's just difference in dose because you don't know what the dose is you get in the vitamins you buy unless you're buying it from a reputable source that tells you what the dose is. And red yeast rice use predated lovastatin. So when lovastatin got approved, they could not have red yeast rice taken off the shelves. You can't say it has lovastatin. You can say supports cardiovascular well-being because there's data to support it. So in the same sense, eventually you will be able to say hemp products that are shown to support anti-inflammatory due to, and there's data for that, but CBD itself will still have this issue surrounding its classification due to it having been approved as a drug. So it didn't exactly answer your question, but that's
although like the red yeast rice, CBD as a supplement was available widely to the public under the 2014 Ninth Circuit ruling, right, which basically allowed CBD to be sold if it were made from hemp produced overseas or outside of the country.
Correct.
So if you take the red yeast rice precedent, why wouldn't that same availability on the open market with the data to back it up, why wouldn't that apply legally to the same issue with CBD? Because
the initial investigative new drug application that GW Pharma filed was in 2008, if I remember. So that particular issue is the 2008 issue when they filed the IND. But that being said, you're right, because there were other examples of CBD's presence in other compounds on the black market, which doesn't, the issue becomes that there was black market and gray market availability of CBD, like Synergy Wellness and that fellow in in the Bay Area who's been selling Valentine X and a number of the other very high CBD strains for cancer patients going back to the 2000s. And so there were breeders that were looking at CBD and looking at specific strains that had CBD in it, even though they weren't calling it cannabidiol, they weren't calling it CBD, they were just saying these are therapeutic strains, and there's proof that those strains had CBD in them, expressed in them prior to the IND that was filed by GW Pharma. So you are, I mean, just in precedent, you're 100% right. And additionally, I think that there's other good news here. The cannabis and hemp plant have hundreds of cannabinoids present, and plant sterols and flavonoids and more. And just to name one that everybody's hearing about now, cannabigerol has
CBG.
CBG has so much of the same benefits as CBD, and in some times even is more effective at anxiety and anti-inflammation and things like that. And so as we look at the combination, the entourage effect of the cannabinoids with the terpenes, the flavonoids, and the plant sterols, you will see CBD will just be an island in an ocean awash with other islands that are going to be many different compounds and combinations of compounds that will provide value. And the CBD market will just be looked at as a blip in the radar eventually, 10 years from now. When we look back, we'll see there's CBG products and CBDV and CBDA and all these other different products that are going to be based upon the many cannabinoids and cannabinoid and partial spectrum and full spectrum supplements that will be available.
See, and the thing is that if you extract anything from any cannabis plant, it's almost impossible to eliminate all CBD from the broad spectrum cannabinoid blends and formulas that you see. I mean, it's ridiculous, actually. And it was ridiculous when they separated out CBD by itself, cannabidiol, as its own isolated molecule in Schedule 1. I mean, there's marijuana, and then there's CBD. I mean, how ridiculous is that? It was completely stupid. So
well, our entire regulatory framework is a mess.
Yeah.
The fact that I've sat in groups of investor meetings where people that have had millions, tens of millions of dollars deployed in the industry, and I've seen this question put to them. Can anybody here tell me what the difference is between cannabis, marijuana, and hemp? Crickets.
Yeah.
Crickets. Because people don't understand that the cannabis plant and its many subspecies are hemp, are marijuana. They're all cannabis. Hemp is a government identifier. Hemp is a cannabis plant that's grown that has less than 0.3% THC currently. That's hemp. Marijuana is the term used to describe anything with high THC. Everything else that has high THC is, technically speaking, considered marijuana on a federal basis. But they're all the cannabis plant. And so we're going, cannabis is changing, and this entire phenomena has changed the dialogue around drug discovery, and now it's changing the dialogue around how we look at plant-based wellness and nutraceuticals and supplements, which is why we're now seeing psilocybin and mushrooms become decriminalized and even legalized in jurisdictions, why we're seeing this tremendous phenomena moving that ahead, while we're seeing ketamine therapy being used for certain instances legally in an off-label use, while we're seeing MDMA trials being done. The good work that Rick Doblin and MAPS has been doing is having a real effect. And so that is part of the phenomena of the change that's coming about because of what you point out with cannabis, hemp, and THC, et cetera. It's so ridiculous, all of these government regulations that are these artifacts of a time when we didn't use data and there was just all this, propaganda-based regulatory frameworks that had no actual scientific and empirical data to support any of it. Now, as we get to a more evidence-based regulatory system, we're going to see tremendous changes. Not going to happen easily, not going to happen overnight, and it will not happen without a lot of work by people like everyone who is part of this event that you put on, but it
Yeah,
is going to change over time.
Education is key, and I call it the absurdity of obduracy. It's just everything just seems so absurd. When you look at this, when you look at the legal framework around all of this, I mean, truly insane. But
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Well, great information. Thank you so much, Leslie.
Well, if there's, there was, I had done a bunch of research, and which we don't have to get. I know that your timing is tight, but if at any point, Denise and I, you and I have been speaking about these issues surrounding contaminants and what was it called, evali, which was it stood for. Oh, what did it stand for? E-cigarette vaping product use associated lung injury, evali. And so the thing that I want to, and knowing that you have 1:30 is the cutoff, and I've gone past that already.
Oh, you can keep talking.
Keep going.
You let me know. Give me the hook when you want to pull me off. So the thing that I wanted to bring up based upon that, Denise, was that it got me to thinking. You brought that up, and we've had these conversations going back to your discoveries, which have been extraordinary, around what led to this, around the vitamin E and everything else that has sort of been coming into the common knowledge about why did we see 2,700 cases in hospitals around the country? Why did we see 30, 40, I don't remember how many deaths, but there were a significant number of deaths. And I mean, obviously, the first thing you can point to is that there's still a black market. This is just like when prohibition existed for alcohol and people were selling methyl alcohol, not ethyl alcohol, and wood alcohol. And people were drinking wood alcohol and getting drunk and then dying because it was so highly poisonous, more poisonous and more toxic than ethyl alcohol. And, in a market where there's prohibition and you don't regulate, you're going to have bad actors who are going to do things like that. That's exactly what happened. And that got me to think, well, other than the obvious, which is we need to regulate to be able to avoid having these black market issues crop up, what is the bigger issue? And keeping in mind, I want to start out by saying I am my entire life I live as a supporter of free markets, as a supporter of the evolution of capitalism to be values-based so that we can see a world where there is interchange of value that is not going to lead to the type of devastation we currently see, whether it is cruelty to animals in animal agriculture. Keeping in mind that I am carnivorous, but I think that doesn't, you don't have to be carnivorous and cruel. You can, although maybe at some point I won't be carnivorous, and I think that vegetarianism has an appeal. But that being said, we have this world where there's just all this cruelty that is cruelty and corruption and non-values-based decisions because people can get away with it. Well, if I can make money while doing harm, but I'm not going to get in trouble, I'm going to do it. Well, that's been the standard that we've seen. That, I think, is changing and evolving, and I'm a big supporter of capitalism in general, and it's a big part of my life. I am a big supporter of the entrepreneurial effort and supporting entrepreneurs on a local and national and global basis. I'm a big believer that we want to be compassionate in our entrepreneurial and capitalist efforts. I'm a big believer that good regulation reduces harm in many ways, not just incarceration, but so many other ways. And with all of that being said, and my background in corporate finance, et cetera, I start to take a look at the issues surrounding testing, product potency, purity, and creating standards on a local, national, and hopefully international basis, just like the entity USP, US Pharmacopoeia, has done, which I think is a very interesting thing to point to. The USP is not a government agency. It predates the FDA by 100 years or more. It evolved in the 1800s in the United States when people were traveling across the country from the East Coast, where there were the population centers, to go to the West Coast and colonize the rest of the country. Well, when you went from Boston to St. Louis, and then St. Louis to San Francisco, how would you know that the medicine you were getting that was for your headaches or for whatever condition you had was going to be the same? You didn't know. You went and got headache medicine in one place. They can claim it's the same thing, but you have no idea. So somebody formed USP, and USP ended up creating a standard system, so you could know if it said USP, it was going to be within certain standards the same thing. Well, USP has continued to function for the ensuing period and helps regulate drugs, potency, purity, and more, as well as pharmaceuticals, drugs, as well as nutraceutical supplements and more, manufacturing processes, etc. And we're going to see their entrance into the cannabis and hemp industry that will establish standards, and that's going to be one thing. But the thing that I think that's missing the most is self-regulation. When alcohol went from prohibition to legal, was it December 1933, I think. When federal prohibition dropped, within a year, there were a number of national self-regulatory organizations. And those self-regulatory organizations actually dealt with the very issues that we're talking about. But they dealt with more than that. They dealt with issues surrounding packaging, issues surrounding supply chain, and they ended up becoming, Discus and these other organizations ended up becoming part of the reason why alcohol remained legal and we didn't see a return to prohibition, because there was some talk about it in the mid 30s, and because for obvious reasons. And so we need to see self-regulation in the cannabis industry. Leslie Engelking has done a great job with focus and trying to bring that to bear. I think that we're going to see more of it, and I think that we probably won't see true self-regulation until federal prohibition drops, which is why we need to work on that. And that being said, we need to be having the conversation now amongst everybody in the industry. Yeah. What will self-regulation look like? How will we get there, and when will we get there?
Right. And Leslie Engelking, you're right, has done an amazing job, and her organization, FOCUS, stands for Foundation of Cannabis Unified Standards. Yeah. So, and she's been working on an international level with that as well. But I think
it's very hard. It's very hard without buy-in from the biggest operators in the industry, and we don't have any real national brands yet. So it's going to be hard to get that, because economically it takes a lot of money. Yeah, millions of dollars. And until you can have individual entities donating $500,000 or more a year, you're just not going to be able to get to what she needs to get to, in my opinion.
Yeah. But you know what? For the most part, though, I think that there has been quite a bit of self-regulation in states where regulation is limited. For example, I think a lot of cannabis producers and formulators have actually gone above and beyond any required testing standards. A lot of them have, and a lot are cutting corners too. But I think that the benefit of self-regulation, like you said, is really going to boil down to how much do we want the federal government coming in and regulating versus self-regulating the industry and setting our own standards that way. So,
it's a real issue. Look what happened in Colorado. And although there have been some attempts, I'm going to say that it's my opinion that we as an industry have fallen far short. Listen, I'm a big fan of, you're not going to find a bigger fan of this industry. That being said, the cannabis industry in particular, and now even the hemp industry, does a lot of appeal to our inner children. We're selling cakes and candies and brownies and gummies and things like that. I have an 8-year-old child. If I were to shake out some of the gummies from the things that I purchased and put it on the counter next to gummies that he goes and gets at the store, he's not going to be able to tell the difference. It looks like children's candy because it is. And that's not okay. I know freedom is freedom, and we want to appeal to our inner child. But yeah, there you go. Right?
Yep.
Right? It looks like That's right. You can't tell the difference. And if you have kids like I do, it presents a real issue. We need to do something to differentiate our products. When you go buy a bottle of Everclear, it doesn't look like a bottle of soda. When you buy a bottle of wine, it doesn't look like a bottle of Mountain Dew or of which has caffeine in it, or even go to Kool-Aid or something like that, or Hawaiian Punch. There is a distinct that's not always the case, but it is to a great extent. And now, why is that? The alcohol industry spends money to differentiate itself and to actually educate. There's a really interesting data point I love. There's a GfK Roper report on youth consumption, and it said that parents are the number one reason kids do not drink. 73% of 13 to 17-year-olds cite their parents as the leading influence on their decisions about whether to drink alcohol or not. That comes from the Beer Institute Commitment to Responsibility report. And that, you know why that exists? Because the alcohol industry self-regulatory agents spent millions of dollars marketing to the parents to educate their children. That's how it happens. The industry, people donate, the big players, Bacardi, Jack Daniels, Fernet Branca, whoever they are, Smirnoff, they donate to these self-regulatory agencies, organizations, millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars a year overall. So they have the budget to put up posters and to have advertising campaigns and things like that to get to the parents, to explain to the parents how to communicate with their children to not have their children drink alcohol. We need to be doing the exact same thing. It's not rocket science. It's worked. We see the data points. The cannabis industry needs to do the same thing. And until we see that type of concerted effort and the money spent to do it, we're going to find things like we saw in Colorado. What did Colorado do? It said, well, if you're going to make gummy candies, they can't look like fruit or animals or spaceships and things like that. They literally like that. There was stuff literally in the law around those lines. So that meant if you made an orange gummy that was colored orange and was circular, is it a fruit? Like there ends up becoming all this gray area about what can you do and what can't you do, and that makes it more expensive. So there were people who were actual producers in Colorado who said, I'm leaving that part of the market because it's become too expensive and fraught with liability. Because if you do that and you're in the gray area of the law and some child ends up eating it and then going to the emergency room and has trauma, have you now exposed yourself to a lawsuit? And since your liability insurance is in a gray area because it's federally illegal, and maybe they're going to pierce the corporate veil to go after you personally, which is, the whole RICO cases that have been being put forth, etc. So my point is, we need to be doing this. It's not happening yet. Denise got me really thinking about this with what you pointed out about the contamination and the EVALI and the illnesses that were coming about. And it got me to think that this is, once again, a critical moment in time where we need to be looking at self-regulation and we need to find a path to do it. I know that Joshua Lederman at NACB had made a really valiant attempt at it from a banking perspective. I'm not sure what their success rate has been. The National Association of Cannabis Businesses. I know that NCIA has been doing what it can to try to help establish self-regulatory agencies, and I know that Leslie has done it as well. I think until we have a true, pure, not-for-profit play that is 100% not attached to any one player in the industry who's profiting from it, people can get paid, but they can't build equity in it. Until that time that we have an entity that's really raising money from the biggest players in the industry and getting the funding from them, that they can go out and do these national campaigns and lobby, we're going to be caught short and flat-footed and still have to dodge the state governments and eventually the federal government trying to regulate us more than they should be.
Well, I think that a lot of these issues will change as it becomes more normalized, and that is going to depend a lot on how we move forward with education, and especially in this particular crisis that we're in right now too.
Wow.
It's going to make a difference.
I couldn't agree more. I think that we are at a point. This crisis points out a few things that, once again, we're seeing a focus on science. We're seeing a focus on laboratories. We're seeing a focus on testing. And I think that we will start to see the beginning of national standards for testing start to evolve. There's a company here in Nevada, Digipath Labs, publicly traded, symbol DIGP. I don't have any equity in it. I know the company and I'd like to work with them, but I have not been working with them, so there's no I have no axe to grind. But I do admire what they've been doing. They've been looking at some paths to establish testing that is in line with what they're doing here, and still can go to other states without needing to go through the other states' regulatory perspectives from having a testing license. They're looking for tools that could be used by law enforcement and more that would be part of this. And I think that we need to see more of that, and we will see more of that coming.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this has been incredible information that you provided us, Leslie. Thank you so much.